Mo, for that very, very generous introduction and slightly fake news, I feel. My accomplishments are not that long, and this book has been, I've been working on it way too long, and I'm kind of like stuck. So I really welcome this opportunity. I thank you for this opportunity to present. Very much a work in progress, very much a mess and confusing, and I look forward to comments and questions. Let me begin by sharing my screen. Can everyone see? Great. So let me just sort of begin by saying that, so the larger project I'm looking at is examining the formation or the production of the Pakistani economy in East Bengal in the immediate aftermath of partition and independence. And this is the title I'm playing with. I have no idea what the title will be. The title I'm kind of presented for this is emphasizing that I'm examining the production of the Pakistani economy in two domains simultaneously. First, in the discursive domain, as an imagined entity, as an object of knowledge and analysis. I look at how academics, intellectuals, economists, technocrats imagine the Pakistani economy as a statistical entity, or as Timothy Mitchell would describe it, as an object of technocratic governance. So this is like intellectual history of the Pakistani economy, if you will. And relatedly, alongside that, I'm looking at the formation of the Pakistani economy in the material domain and in social life in particular spaces. The book has three case studies through which I want to examine the material formation of the Pakistani economy. I look at steamships, river steamboats on the Ganges, Brahmaputra, and Meghna. I look at the borders between the hills and the plains, particularly the Tripura East Bengal border. And I look at village homesteads, the sort of the compound of huts, ponds, fruit trees, domestic animals, familial relations that make agrarian houses. And I try to show in each of those spaces how the Pakistani economy sort of came to be in the everyday lives of people. For today's talk, I thought I'd give you, I mean, this might be a bit too much and I might run out of time and I might lose my train of thought. So forgive me if any and all of that happens. But I thought I'd give you a flavor of both, of the discursive imagination of the Pakistani economy, and on the one hand, and the material constitution of the Pakistani on the other. Let me begin with the imagined economy, partly because the Pakistani economy was imagined well before the Pakistani state was created, particularly through a debate on Pakistan's economic viability. The Muslim League's political opponents in the Congress responded to the Lahore resolution with economic skepticism. They expressed doubts about the economic viability of a, quote, autonomous and sovereign state comprised of, quote, territorially readjusted Muslim majority regions. Economic skepticism was discursively powerful. The question of economic viability, would a Muslim state carved out of British India be able to economically support itself, insisted on the kind of specifics that the Muslim League wished to avoid. It insisted that they express the Pakistani state as numbers, as square miles of territory, millions of workers, and crores of rupees. It required working out answers to questions like, would the future Muslim state include all of Punjab and Bengal, or only Muslim majority districts? Would the new state pay for its own defense, or would the two states share an army? Would they form a currency and customs union? The Muslim League insisted that these were questions that could be worked out, details that would be worked out later, once the principle of Indian Muslim sovereignty was accepted. The Congress responded, however, that they could only accept Muslim sovereignty if economic viability was demonstrated. The League would, of course, sort of respond by saying that, well, you can imagine the debate. So the future state's economic viability becomes a topic of scholarly inquiry. Scholars innovated methods to enumerate the future economy and devise statistical tests of viability, publishing their findings as monographs, journal articles, and pamphlets. The Pakistani economy was imagined through a publishing boom of expert commentary on the Pakistan question. For book publishers, public interest on the Lahore resolution constituted markets and profits. B.R. Ambedkar, in his 1941 Thoughts on Pakistan, wrote, "Every Indian must read a book on Pakistan. If not this, then some other, if he wants to help his country steer a clear path." Ambedkar's book would go on to become a bestseller, going to 3 editions before partition. The second edition would be renamed. The Thoughts on Pakistan would get a less modest title, Pakistan or the Partition of India. And this is up on the image. I have a cover of the third edition, and you can see the marketing tag. Of the many books on the subject, there is none which has either the breadth or depth which this has. This publishing boom resulted in the production of the Pakistani economy. The Pakistani economy was produced as part of a publishing boom and took the form of a scholarly bibliography. I have selected these texts on this list as a bibliography of the Pakistani economy before the Pakistani state is created, and I follow certain rules in deciding which texts to include. First, the text must be written by a self-described or self-proclaimed or recognized, publicly recognized public intellectual, an expert, an academic with the requisite credentials. The text should be in English, which is the language of global expertise, and it should cite or be cited by one other text on the list. Following the chain of citation, following citational politics, reveals the marginalization of Muslim scholars and pro-Pakistan views on the Pakistani economy. The paucity of Muslim scholars is indicative of the following. Academic publishing was dominated by upper caste Hindus. The economy was not part of the Muslim imagination of Pakistan, but rather imposed from the outside. The text is limited to English. All the writings in Urdu and Bengali, major languages in which Pakistan, the idea of Pakistan was worked out, did not enter a global discourse on the economy. The authors of these texts are a diverse group from different academic backgrounds, institutional affiliations, and scholarly repute. Ambedkar is undoubtedly the most famous scholar on the list, but there's also Reginald Copeland, Oxford Don, the Beit Professor of Colonial History at Oxford. Radha Kamal Mukherjee is on the list, a reputed scholar of agrarian economics and at the time Vice Chancellor of the University of Lucknow. K.T. Shah, his colleague on the Congress National Planning Committee, is on the list as well. On the other hand, lesser-known scholars like M. Sadiq and Nafis Ahmed are on the list, who they both taught at Islamia College, Calcutta, marginal institution in the colonial hierarchy of knowledge, but a center of Bengali Muslim Pakistan politics. Oscar Spate is an interesting character who's on the list. Oscar Spate was a lecturer in geography at Rangoon University who ended up in Calcutta during the Japanese invasion and evacuation. The list includes researchers from the corporate world. Homi Modi and John Mathai are both executives in the Tata Group of Industries. G.D. Birla is on the list, one of the leading industrialists of India. The list includes three future ministers and a future president of independent India. Ambedkar would become Law Minister, John Mathai, the Railway and then Finance Minister, Rajendra Prasad, the Minister of Agriculture, and then the President of India. So this bibliography includes, I would say, two major ways in which the Pakistani economy was imagined and envisioned before the Pakistani state was created. A group of economists, the critics of Pakistan, beginning with Ambedkar, even though he supported the Pakistan demand, I'll explain a little bit. A group of economists, I would say the mainstream orthodox view, tended to calculate the Pakistani economy as a fraction of the economy of British India. They would go through colonial statistics of government revenue, trade, industrial capacity, mineral resources, all the blue books and industrial reports, and they would disaggregate those numbers and reaggregate them into new territorial forms to create this new statistical entity you could call the Pakistani economy. They would then subject that entity towards a series of hypotheses and tests. Would the government generate sufficient revenue to meet its basic expenditure? Would the territory produce sufficient commodities to meet the needs of its population? Would they have sufficient mineral resources, coal, iron, etc., to support a program of industrialization? Um, by and large, the scholarship came to the conclusion that Pakistan would be barely viable, just about able to maintain its existence with no spare revenue or resources to provide a modicum of social welfare, much less a future program of industrialization. The Muslim League's champions responded to this kind of scholarship by saying that their opponents lacked imagination. Um, Let me quote from Nafis Ahmed and his 1947 book, The Basis of Pakistan. Economically, the Pakistan lands are stamped with poverty and backwardness. And what is most interesting is the fact that the picture of the present economic condition is regarded as immutable. Their revenues today are small, therefore Pakistan areas will not be able to bear Rafiz Ahmed is describing his critics. Many provide a highly distorted picture of the industrial resources of the Pakistani areas, which are declared to be doomed as backward pastoral come agricultural regions. Instead of this sort of fraction, lack kind of narrative being proposed, scholars like Sadiq, Nafis Ahmed, and others suggest take a very different approach. Instead, they don't imagine Pakistan as a fraction of the British Indian economy, but as a range of future possibilities and potentials that would be unleashed by Indian Muslim sovereignty and by the creation of an Indian Muslim state. They don't say Pakistan will produce this much rice because British India produces this much rice. They say Pakistan will raise its agricultural productivity to the levels of Japan and hence produce this much rice. They don't say Pakistan has no coal or iron. They say Pakistan will unleash a program of mineral exploration, which will discover enormous quantities of minerals below the soil. So they can see like that it's all about what independence and sovereignty will give to the new nation. For Pakistan's critics, this approach was unscientific. They weren't convinced at all. W.D. Croft, an Indian office official, wrote, advocates of Pakistan indulge in a good deal of loose argument and wishful thinking on the economic aspect of the idea, or indeed, in many cases, they seem to close their eyes to it altogether. So you have an orthodox view of the Pakistani economy barely viable, a fraction of the statistics of the British Indian economy, an unorthodox, marginal view of the future possibilities to be unleashed by Indian Muslim liberation. Both sides, however, agree that East Pakistan or East Bengal without Calcutta is economically a disaster. It is economically simply impossible. Nafis Ahmed, who's writing just a month before Mountbatten's partition announcement, asks that Calcutta should be made a quote, free or international zone with rights of equal access to Pakistan or Hindustan. The Bengal Muslim League would respond to the partition or the exclusion of Calcutta, the last-ditch effort to create a united independent Bengal, an effort that was very much informed by the idea that East Bengal without Calcutta is just meaningless. Jinnah, of course, gave his support to the united independent Bengal scheme with the memorable quote, "What is the use of Bengal without Calcutta? They had much better remain independent and united." The Congress, of course, scuppered all these plans, and perhaps believing that East Bengal would inevitably economically collapse and be reabsorbed into India. Nehru told Mountbatten in May 1947 that he, quote, felt that a partition now would anyhow bring East Bengal into Hindustan in a few years. So this is kind of the early imagination, if you will, of the Pakistan economy leading up to 1947. There's a very strong idea of what the economy already is, even before the state is created. The Pakistani, of course, East Pakistan didn't economically collapse, right? I mean, in the words of one retired official, Pakistan was, quote, here to stay. So staying in the realm of the economic imagination, I wanted to ask, what does it mean for the economy to be here to stay? What does it mean for the economy to have stayed, I suppose? And the answer, I argue, is to be found in Pakistan's membership to the IMF. Membership in the IMF gave the Pakistani economy, the imagined discursive economy, global recognition and legitimacy. And it's actually a really good story that I don't think people know, because Pakistan's membership to the IMF was a long, protracted process, 3 years of negotiations. As part of the partition, India inherited British India's membership in the IMF as a founding member, and Pakistan had to apply anew. Each IMF member, when they're admitted, are given a quota. They're handed a quota, which is a measure of the country's economic significance in a global economy, and it determines the number of votes they hold in the IMF Council, their theoretical borrowing limit. I'm not going to go through the formula for the quota, but you can see this. Um, of course, the problem with this quota is that Pakistan did not exist on any of these dates. 2% of national income in 1940, Pakistan didn't exist. 5% of Pakistan existed in 1943. Pakistan. If the viability of the Pakistani economy debate pre-partition was about imagining a future economy yet to be created, Pakistan's membership in the IMF involved imagining the Pakistani economy before it was created, before partition. So the IMF, Pakistan approaches the IMF for membership in September of 1947. The IMF writes to the Pakistani government asking for this data. What was Pakistan's national income in 1940? What was Pakistan's gold and dollar holdings? The IMF, of course, not dumb, the IMF economists. They know that Pakistan did not exist. They suggested that the Pakistani government express these numbers as a fraction of that of British India. The Pakistani government did not. When they submitted their application in March of 1948, they made up a whole, they actually computed what Pakistan's national income in 1940 through sheer guesstimates, but they computed it from the ground up by adding up what they believed to be the national income of the regions that were now in Pakistan. They computed, so they provide those figures and they ask the IMF for a quota of $100 million. The IMF, which is, India's quota at the time was 500 something million dollars. So if just for reference, just for balance. The IMF responds by the IMF, the IMF researchers take those numbers, plug them into their formula, come up with their own number for the quota, and suggest a quota of $50 million. The Pakistani government says, no, we don't accept. IMF ups the offer to $60 million. Pakistan walks away from the negotiation, says that they are prepared to stay out of the IMF indefinitely unless the IMF meets its quota. For 3-4 months, negotiations are forestalled. In February 1949, they resume. They resume primarily because of political pressure, with the Americans and the British trying to get Pakistan in. IMF economists end up coming up with new formulas to come up with a higher quota, so trying to calculate what would Pakistan's quota be as a ratio of India's. Pakistani economists submit a new memorandum arguing for an even higher quota, where they say, given that we don't have the statistics, we should think about which country Pakistan is most like in the existing IMF membership and assign a similar quota. And they say Pakistan is most like Australia, Poland, or Brazil, each of which have a quota of more than 100 million. Ultimately, Pakistan does receive its quota of 100 million. And this is the invitation card for July 1950 for the reception the IMF hosted at the Carlton Hotel to celebrate Pakistan's membership. This membership Pakistan is the only post-colonial country I know of which negotiated the IMF for a higher quota. Pakistan's membership was considered the same time as Albania, Liberia, and Siam, Thailand, none of which argued for a higher quota. The IMF itself got very frustrated that the Pakistani government had made it into a negotiation over their quota. And no subsequent, after Pakistan, the European empires streamlined their procedure of transitioning colonies to IMF membership. They would arrange for IMF membership even before in decolonization. So no country could actually negotiate the terms of IMF membership. Pakistan is literally the only post-colonial country to negotiate the terms of IMF membership. And they gained recognition. I have this quote, but I think it is something of a declaration of independence here, of economic independence, if you will. It is time that it were clearly recognized that the fact that India and Pakistan were parts of one country at one time is now, sorry, that's a typo, is now a matter of history. In any present-day economic analysis of conditions in the two countries, it is obviously desired to be realistic, etc., etc. Pakistan is an independent economy which needs to be treated and recognized as such. it is through IMF membership that at the discursive, technocratic domain, Pakistan gains recognition for its economy as a sovereign entity, as an independent, autonomous entity to be managed by its own technocracy. And this, to me, is sort of a culmination. It's a moment of triumph for a new state technocracy, right? It's a moment of triumph for Pakistani economists who first argued against an orthodoxy that Pakistan would be economically unviable, and then argued against an orthodoxy that Pakistan was economically insignificant. And this is kind of like the arrival, if you will, of the Pakistani economy onto a global stage. The debate on viability comes to a close. Let me, with that, turn to the material economy. What's happening? So this is, in the way I'm imagining the book, the first chapter will be the discursive economic viability debate, the debate on Pakistan's membership in the IMF, and then I'll turn to three chapters which examines the formation of the Pakistani economy in three spaces as three kind of separate case studies. I'll describe two of them for the talk, and I'll try and keep it quick because I really do want questions, but so I might end up doing something like gesturing towards the larger project a lot more than I intend to. Let me begin with steamships. At the time of partition, two British companies, the India General Navigation, IGN, and the River Steam Navigation, RSN, held a monopoly over steam transport on the Podda, the Jamuna, the Brahmaputra, and the Meghna. And this map on the right of my screen is the steamer routes. They held a monopoly on steamers. They were the only companies that operated steamers, mechanized transport on these rivers. The British shareholders of these two companies owned 1,200 vessels, two Calcutta dockyards, Riverside Docks, warehouses, and ticketing agencies in 324 river ports. They employed a float staff, that is, workers aboard steamboats, of 16,000 people, and an onshore staff of clerical workers, engineers, repairmen, dockers, porters of another 20,000 people. It was a massive formation of capital, of colonial capital on Bengal and Assam's rivers. I won't go into the details, but there's something specific about the way in which steamships and railways develop in Bengal, where they interconnect into a larger transportation grid, all of which converges on Calcutta. In the project, I examine how the post-colonial and Indian and Pakistani states sought to partition this formation of colonial capital on rivers such that the vessels owned by the British shareholders were managed by either Pakistani or Indian registered subsidiaries, that the vessels were registered under either the Pakistani or Indian Inland Vessels Act, that they plied on Pakistani or Indian waters, that they moved between Pakistani or Indian river ports, that they carried Pakistani or Indian commodities, that they employed Pakistani or Indian crews, that they reported profits and losses separately in Pakistan and in India, and that they paid taxes to the Pakistani or Indian state. So basically, the colonial states, instead of expropriating colonial capital, which was an option, nationalizing steamer service, which was an option, they decided to dismantle and disentangle colonial steamer services into its constituent units of steamships, workers, bank accounts, corporate entities, and to divide those between their respective national economies, to assign them a nationality and to divide them between their national economies. This sort of divisions of colonial capital can be told through a history of policy making. A policy history of the division of colonial capital will look at how the imposition of trade and customs policies partitioned Indian commodities from Pakistani commodities. So steamers are stopped at a river port where a customs official comes on and says, oh, those are Indian commodities that pay taxes. Those are Pakistani commodities that pay taxes there. The devaluation crisis is about the partitioning of currencies. So one company your profits and losses are either in Pakistani rupees or Indian rupees. So you're dividing the capital base, if you will. We can think 1950, there's both India and Pakistan have new Inland Vessels Act, which stipulates that vessels must be registered in the country where they spend the most time. The companies are forced to divide their fleets between Pakistan registered vessels and India registered vessels. In 1952, the introduction of passports means that workers are now either Pakistani or Indian, so on and so forth. I'm not, however, interested in telling the story from above, this sort of policy history take imposed by the state. It's an interesting story. There are these wonderful documents describing this very delicate dance, sort of gentlemanly um, negotiations between post-colonial bureaucrats and colonial capitalists, where each are testing out the other's limits and very gradually, very gentlemanly, in a very kind of polite way, dividing up these things. But that's not the history I'm interested in. The history I'm interested in is about how steamer crews resisted, negotiated, and contested the division of their workplaces. I won't go into details, there's a lot. The chapters themselves, the chapter itself is organized around three major strikes by steamboat crews. And the steamboat crews themselves are the major characters in the chapter, the major agents of the chapter. Mostly Bengali Muslim, mostly from the Meghna estuary, which is the Lashkar belt, also providing labor on oceanic steamships traveling the world, who would, or very much, very militant, I mean, had been in the nationalist period, in the pre-colonial period, very much a very organized, active labor movement, which was very much also involved in the nationalist movement, particularly for Pakistan. Very quickly, the first strike I look at Chilmari and Khulna in 1950 is a borderland strike, where the steamboat crews stop their vessels right at the borderland, at the border port, and they strike against the checks being made by the customs officials of the new countries. They strike against the checks, the vessels being stopped, and their own possessions being searched by customs officers. The second strike at Jagannathganj, which is on the Jamuna, on the Brahmaputra, near Shirajganj. Just to show you where it's around here. You can see Jagannathganj on the map there. So it's an amazing strike. The story of the strike is that the cruise unions, this is a strike that results from the cruise unions partition. The Indian union separates from the Pakistani union and declares a strike on its own. And the vessels, the Indian registered vessels, form a picket line across the river, stopping only Indian registered vessels but allowing Pakistani registered vessels to pass. I'll say a little bit more about the strike, but it was a very critical strike where it resulted in a separation of the contracts under which workers on Pakistan registered vessels and workers on Indian registered vessels worked. That was the net effect of the strike. The third strike I look at was in throughout East Bengal, really, but focused in Borishal in 1963, which would result, in the midst of the India-China war, firstly, which was like major because it would India's communication with the Northeast is through these steamboats, right? So that was major, but it would also result in the bankruptcy of the colonial companies. This was the final blow for the colonial companies, was this strike. What I try to argue through these strikes is that while the post-colonial states were partitioning colonial capital, dividing it between their respective national economies, steamer crews were actually interested in decolonizing colonial capital. And they were actually interested in claiming, they were striking against sort of colonial management of labor. They were striking against many of those things that there was an actual attempt to create a different kind of economy from below than the sort of partition imagination of the states. I don't know why I have this, but I kind of like this. I have this because I like this, I suppose. These are the figures that I want to build a chapter around. If the first chapter is about the Pakistani technocracy, the second chapter is about workers and this chapter is about, I don't know if it's going to second or third, is about steamship crews. The steamer companies interviewed the major strikers right after, this is the 1952 strike. and they created these sort of thumbnail profiles of the major strikers. And this is all the information I have about them. I don't have any more information about these figures than these very sketchy colonial profiles. But you can imagine Karibal Mola, manifest clerk of the Taraki. Karibal was supposedly the strike leader, and they're kind of surprised by him. The appearance of this man was most surprising, as he's no more than a youth of 17 or 18, of rather small stature, and not altogether unengaging appearance. I wonder what that means, not altogether unengaging appearance. He speaks good English. No attempt was made to go into the details of the strike, as it was apparent from the outset that he was not going to commit himself in any way as one of the leaders. Muhammad Ali, who's the Sukani is the helmsman of the Ibadan, who served with the company for 22 years. This man was rather insolent, and I would say a bad type. He looked to me to be a type of individual with a rather vile nature, and would quite easily be a strike leader. From his appearance and his manner, however, we would say that he was a strong man, and that the manifest clerk provided the brains. He looks and acts like a thug. And then there's Medamia, who's a Lashkar, who's like the lowest of the shipboard hierarchy of the laborers. And he says, rather unexpectedly, this man was rather a pleasant type. His age was about 20, and he told us quite openly that he was one of the volunteer strikers. When he was told that we had been informed that he was the commander of the volunteers, he smiled rather sheepishly and said that the others had followed and obeyed him, though he had not wanted to be their leader. The impression that we got was that most of the strike work that this individual had done was out of pure devilment. These sort of stock characters, the brains, the muscle, the happy-go-lucky Lashkar, I obviously want to flesh them out more than these colonial thumbnails, but really it's about mobilizing labor into the story of the making of the national economy and showing how the national economy wasn't just imagined or imposed by technocrats and policymakers, but was actually realized from below. How am I on time, Mo? Sorry, I can't hear you.
Yes, of course. I forgot that my audio was off. About 6 minutes to 40 minutes.
Okay,
I think you can go to 45, Tariq, if you really wanted to.
I don't think I really want to, but
Okay.
I'll try and wrap up in 6 minutes.
Mhm.
Very sketchy. I gave you a very sketchy overview of how I want to do the steamboat chapter. I'm going to give you another sketchy overview of how I want to talk about the hills and the plains. So one of the case studies is about how to partition rivers and riverine transport. Another chapter is about how to partition the hills and the plains. I really like this map. It's a topographical map of Bangladesh. And you can see in the map just the care with which every single hill is drawn out, the detail with which hills are just excluded from Bangladesh. And I love this little peninsula of plainland. Can you see it? This little thing, is my mouse clear? This little peninsula of plainland jutting out of Noakhali into Tripura. Like, imagine the detail with which some cartographer went in. Okay, hill, let's take that out. Let's include that in India or in Tripura in this case. There's a common perception that the borders of 47 were drawn afresh. There were new borders that had no social meaning before 47. The borders between the hills and the plains are very old borders that long predate 1947. This border between Sylhet and present-day Meghalaya at the top is arguably Bangladesh's first boundary. That's title of David Ludden's article about the borders between Sylhet and Meghalaya, drawn in 1792. So that's how early it is drawn. And is drawn as part of, this is part of the conquest of the hills, right? This is part of bounding out the hills, drawing a line between what the British then perceived to be the ungovernable, untaxable hills, a racial border between civilized, property-owning, tax-paying Bengalis and quote-unquote tribal, mobile, June cultivating, Swidden cultivating peoples who don't pay taxes. These borders, David Ludden shows that the 1792 border here, the 1792 border here was it was accompanied by intense racial ethnic violence. There was a forcible exclusion of Khasis from the plains. Khasis were driven out from the plains. They had to They were not allowed, they were only allowed to enter the plains through specific routes to trade on trade days. They were not allowed to own property and so forth. And of course, Bengalis were forbidden from entering the hills. This was an attempt to racially fix populations, Bengalis on the plains, Khassias in the hills. If this border is 1792, the border between Mymensingh and the Garo Hills is drawn in the 1820s. The northeastern border between Sylhet and Tripura is drawn also in the 1830s. And the border I want to talk about today, the border here, including this little jut of plainland, was drawn in 1853. A little background history, I suppose, is necessary. When East India Company conquers Bengal, Tripura is not a hill kingdom. It has dominions in both the hills and the plains. The Mughals assess a tax on the Tripura kingdom, which is paid in both rupees, which is paid in rupees, elephants, and other hill kind of commodities. The British, upon taking over Tripura, however, or upon taking over Bengal, decide that the Tripura's plainland positions would be a simple zamindari in Bengal, which they call the Chakla Roshanabad zamindari, and Tripura's hill territories would be the sovereign territories, which they name Hill Tipura. So they effectively partitioned Tripura, the kingdom of Tripura, into a plainland zamindari and into a sovereign hill territory. And they draw the border in 1853, including this jut of plainland you see here, because the Tripura Raja's debts. They start debating whether or not to auction the zamindari to recover his debts. And in order to auction the zamindari, they must know what the limits of the zamindari are, which is what prompts this border-making exercise. These borders, I think, as many scholars of the Northeast have written, these borders change meaning very dramatically in the late 19th century as the colonial capitalist conquest breaches into the hills, right? Like the hills are being actively converted into tea gardens, forest reserves, and so forth. In this borderland, we see a similar process of colonial sort of property ownership moving beyond the border. I also want to say, I mean, before I go on, I think every scholar of the Northeast has said this. You can't actually draw a line between the hills and the plains. It's just the hills and the plains are this confused. The zone of the foothills are very, very expansive. So instead of like a clear line, here are the hills, here are the plains, we get an extensive zone of foothills with ridges and hillocks and low-lying areas and swamps and valleys, which the border sort of draws an imprecise line between. The border, however, gains very specific meanings in the late 19th and early 20th century as the Tripura kingdom embarks on its own sort of economic modernization program. First, they start, a few things are necessary here to point out. They decide to they decide to claim the value. They follow colonial policies. They create forest reserves on their side of the border, on the hills on their side of the border, where they exclude both swidden cultivators and peasants who use the forests as a pasture and a common, who use the forest to graze cattle or collect firewood or building materials and so forth. So they create a border between the hills, between the forested hills and the cultivated plains. And second, the Tripura government also starts offering incentives to Bengali Muslim farmers to move and establish farms in the plainlands deeper inside Tripura. They're called jungle abadi leases. So come and cultivate this jungle. And they offer these leases on favorable terms to the tenants in their own zamindari. And what happens is that many tenants in the zamindari maintain homes in the zamindari while establishing farms across the border in Tripura. What we get around the border is perhaps an agrarian economy, which includes pastures, commons, farms, markets. I didn't show the railway line here, but the Assam-Bengal Railway will skirt all along the Tripura territory between Chittagong and Dibrugarh, somewhere here. It would go all along Tripura territory. Agartala would be served by Akhaura. It would never enter Tripura territory, right? It would go all along. Agartala, the Tripura capital, is served by Akhaura, the train station on this side. So markets, so basically with partition, as the border between the hills and the plains is repurposed as the international borders between India and Pakistan, we get Pakistan inherits the markets, Pakistan inherits the zamindari, Pakistan inherits the farms. Tripura or India, with the accession of Tripura, inherits the forests, the reserve forests, the jungle abadi farms, and and both governments then try to claim what their inheritance for their national economy, which results in a violent uprising on the borderlands. In the first 2, 3 years in my count, about 40 people are killed by in my count, and which is a very limited count based on the archives, in protest and counter-protest. Here's an example of the forest protests. At 1700, and this is because the Indian government has sort of suddenly, or the Tripura government still, has suddenly increased its fees for peasants to access forests. So the district magistrate of Noakhali, and this, by the way, is happening. These incidents are from that little plainland peninsula, Chagulnaya Upazila of Noakhali. At 1700 hours on October 8th, about 11 military personnel and some policemen, along with one elephant, belonging either to Tripura or the government of India, trespassed into village Joychandpur. They arrested 3 Pakistanis, including one Hindu Pakistani, on ground of grazing their cattle without permits. Large crowd gathered and they were fired upon by military personnel. 2 men reported to be injured. Military personnel took away one Pakistani, leaving an elephant with mahout at place of occurrence. 2 Pakistanis are still untraced. The Dewan of Tripura 2 days later wrote, facts reported to District Magistrate Noakhali entirely incorrect. Actual facts are party of 11 armed constables with a state elephant arrested 4 forest produce smugglers, it's a new title, at different points within Tripura state. When the state police arrived at Ballamuk within Tripura state, within Tripura state, they were attacked by about 500 lawless people of Noakhali district. The lawless people of Noakhali would become a real problem for Tripura. The assailants trespassed into the state and were variously armed. They attacked the police party to snatch away arrested smugglers. 3 of the 4 arrested escaped. The state police, attacked by overwhelming numbers, had to open a fire in self-defense. The injured person was brought to Belonia and Tripura admitted to hospital. The state elephant with mahout was forcibly driven by the mob into East Bengal and detained there till now. These incidents were rife and commonplace during the first 5 years of partition. The person who was admitted to Belonia hospital died in hospital and is, to me, the first casualty of the borderland forest wars. The elephant, I don't know what happened to the elephant, but he was being held, the archive has it, he was being held at the Noakhali police station, he or she. The second story, of course, is about the jungle abadi farms. And as the Indian government started restricting the ability of farmers to carry produce back from their Tripura farms to their Indian homes. And this resulted in, again, a mass sort of protest of borderland peasants against Indian government policy. And what I find very interesting, a claim by Pakistani farmers, Pakistan, like identifying themselves as Pakistani farmers, but not just as Pakistani farmers, as frontier peasants of the Pakistani state. In December 49, a massive protest of reportedly of hundreds of thousands, reportedly, probably tens of thousands of people, were organized at the junior madrasa of Chagulnaya district, which is like, again, in that peninsula I showed you. Following that mass meeting, Chadmia would send out a press notice to all the major papers of East Pakistan, including the major paper, the Daily Azad. And I'm just going to read out sort of to indicate the kinds of political subjectivities that are emerging. We are the residents of Chagulnaya Thana. The Pakistan border areas is our home. Shimantoborti elaka amader boshobash. But our lands and farms have been included in Tripura Kingdom. Our lands and crops have been imprisoned in Tripura. Our crops are kept under the guard of military. Jungle animals are destroying our crops, but we are not allowed to go to our lands. If we cannot cultivate our lands, some 16,000 people have to starve with their wives and children. We call the attention. These protests against the divisions against sort of as the state went about trying to dismantle, take apart a colonial economy, a colonial riverine economy, a colonial agrarian economy, break it up into its little bits and pieces, into units of capital, labor, property, assign those units a citizenship, reconfigure them into a new territorial form, the economy of Pakistan and East Bengal, the Indian economy. People rose up in protest. People negotiated, contested, and resisted. And what I want to argue in the book is ultimately shaped the post-colonial national economies that were being created. I'll stop here. I was going to say one more, but I'll just leave that slide up. Okay, I'll just say one more. So the last chapter goes back to the imagined economy and to the question of Bangladeshi nationalism, particularly the Bangladeshi academics who in the 60s revisited the question of the imagined economy and claimed that East Bengal was an internal colony of Pakistan. So it required, that was again a practice of discursive imagination. So the arc of the book would be, we begin with the discursive imagined economy, we meander through stories of labor and protest, and we end up back at the imagined Bangladeshi economy, if you will. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Ali, for that fantastic talk. As usual, absolutely brilliant. We have a lot of questions. Some of them you can see in the chat. And if anyone wants to raise their hand and ask it, we are very happy to take those questions as well.